blaring alarms of the emergency room sliced through the night, an incessant symphony of chaos that never seemed to end. Nurses and doctors moved with determined urgency, their faces reflecting the harsh glow of overhead fluorescent lights. Emily Parker, a seasoned emergency room nurse, navigated the labyrinth of gurneys and medical equipment with practiced ease. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the sharp tang of sweat and stress, filling the air with an almost tangible tension. Emily's heart raced, but her demeanor remained calm and composed. She adjusted her mask and focused on the next patient being wheeled in, a young man with severe head trauma. "Let's move. We've got a code blue," Emily called out, her voice a beacon of authority amid the cacophony. Her team sprang into action, working seamlessly to stabilize the patient. With every beeping monitor and hurried command, Emily felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The chaos of the night seemed endless. Emily's mind raced as she moved from one crisis to another. A young woman with a deep laceration, an elderly man struggling to breathe. It was a relentless parade of emergencies. Each case demanded immediate attention and left little room for error. Hours passed, the shift feeling like an eternity. Emily glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. Just as she was about to catch her breath, a new wave of urgency hit. A new patient was arriving, her condition listed as critical. "Prepare the trauma bay," Emily barked, her voice cutting through the din. She glanced at the information scrolling across the screen and felt a jolt of adrenaline. This was a particularly severe case. The patient's vital signs were failing, and the urgency was palpable. The stretcher arrived, and Emily's team gathered around. The patient was covered by a thin blanket, her face obscured. Emily could only see a hint of disheveled hair and the steady rise and fall of the patient's chest. The team quickly assessed the situation, working with precision. Emily's focus was razor-sharp as she intently examined the patient's medical record. The familiar sound of beeping monitors and the steady rhythm of footsteps provided a backdrop to her intense concentration. She glanced at the patient's ID, her fingers brushing against the information. That was when she saw the name Joan Parker. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat as the name registered. Joan Parker, her mother's name. She shook her head in disbelief, struggling to maintain her professional composure. This couldn't be happening. The world around her seemed to blur, the sounds of the emergency room growing distant. Her mind raced as she fought to keep her focus. This was not the time for personal revelations. She had a duty to perform, to save this woman's life. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She turned her attention back to the task at hand, but the realization lingered like a heavy shadow. Emily's hands worked mechanically as she assisted with the patient's care. Each movement was deliberate, but her thoughts were consumed by the connection she had just discovered. The intensity of the night seemed to heighten as she grappled with the emotional impact of her discovery. The hours dragged on as the team fought to stabilize Joan. Emily's emotions were a tumultuous storm, but she remained focused on her role. As the clock inched towards dawn, she felt the strain of the night's events taking its toll. Finally, the immediate crisis was under control. Joan was stable, but the situation was far from resolved. Emily took a moment to collect herself, leaning against the wall in the dimly lit corridor. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on her chest. The emergency room, once a haven of controlled chaos, now felt like a stage for an emotional drama unfolding within Emily. She knew that this night was far from over, and the true challenge was only beginning. The emergency room had quieted down to a low hum of activity, the earlier chaos giving way to a tense lull. Emily stood by Joan Parker's bed, her mind a storm of confusion and dread. Joan's condition had stabilized, but the sight of the woman lying unconscious in front of her was a sharp, dissonant note in Emily's otherwise ordered world. Emily's eyes traced the lines of Joan's face, her heart pounding with each shallow breath Joan took. The delicate features, once hidden by the veil of a blanket, now lay exposed. Emily's thoughts raced, replaying the fleeting images of her mother she had only seen in distant memories and old photographs. The resemblance was unmistakable. With a determined breath, Emily approached the bed, her hand brushing against Joan's wrist to check the drip. The familiar sight of the intravenous needle and the steady drip of fluids seemed oddly comforting amid the disarray. But comfort was fleeting. The reality of the situation hit Emily with a jarring force. "Stay focused," Emily muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. She adjusted the monitor settings, the soft beeping providing a rhythmic backdrop to her turbulent thoughts. The beeps seemed to echo with a haunting melody, blending with the soft hum of the air conditioning and distant conversations. As she worked, her mind drifted to the past, a blur of fragmented memories. Images of a young Emily, struggling to understand her mother's absence, surfaced like ghosts. She remembered the empty chair at the dinner table, the unanswered questions, the silent tears. Joan had been a phantom in her life, a void filled with unanswered questions and unresolved pain. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she administered medication, the small vials and syringes feeling heavier than usual. Her professional training was a lifeline, a tool to keep her anchored. But the personal revelation threatened to pull her under. "Is she going to be all right?" a voice asked, pulling Emily back to the present. It was Dr. Harris, her colleague and friend, who had stepped in to check on the patient. His voice was calm but laced with concern. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on Joan. "She's stable for now, but we need to keep a close eye on her. The next few hours are critical." Dr. Harris nodded, his eyes narrowing with concern. "Keep me updated. I'll be in the break room if you need me." As he left, Emily found herself alone with Joan once more. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls lined with equipment and the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic. Emily felt a wave of sadness wash over her, mingling with the stress and exhaustion from the night. Emily's phone buzzed, a distraction that offered a brief escape from her spiraling thoughts. She glanced at the screen, messages from friends, family, and a reminder about her next shift. Each notification felt like an intrusion into the fragile bubble of her current reality. She silenced the phone, focusing once more on Joan. As the minutes ticked by, Emily's resolve hardened. She couldn't let her personal feelings interfere with her professional responsibilities. She was a nurse, after all, bound by a code of care and empathy. Yet, the emotional weight of seeing her mother in such a vulnerable state was inescapable. Emily reached for the chart at the foot of the bed, trying to immerse herself in the medical details. Her eyes skimmed over the familiar notations and updates, but her mind was elsewhere. The revelation of Joan's identity had turned Emily's world upside down. She needed answers, but for now, she had to focus on ensuring Joan's survival. The night seemed to stretch endlessly as Emily continued her vigil. The once chaotic emergency room now felt like a silent witness to her internal struggle. Each beep of the monitor, each shift of Joan's body, seemed to amplify the gravity of the situation. Emily knew that the revelation was just the beginning. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the windows, Emily felt the weight of the night pressing heavily upon her. She had to confront not only the reality of her mother's condition, but also the deeper, more painful truth of their fractured relationship. The soft glow of dawn crept through the narrow window blinds, casting long shadows across the hospital room. Emily Parker stood by Joan's bedside, the early morning light revealing the weariness etched into her features. The room was quieter now, the frenetic energy of the night giving way to a more subdued atmosphere. Yet, for Emily, the silence was deafening. She glanced at the heart monitor, its steady beeping a small comfort in the midst of her turmoil. Joan's condition was stable, but the emotional weight of the past few hours felt like an anchor dragging her deeper into an abyss of unresolved feelings. Emily's thoughts were a tangled mess of memories and emotions, each one crashing against the other like waves in a stormy sea. Emily's gaze drifted to the photograph on the bedside table, a faded image of a young woman with a bright smile, a picture of a family she barely remembered. It was her mother, but it might as well have been a stranger. The photograph seemed to mock Emily, its glossy surface reflecting a past she could never fully grasp. "Why now?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled up a chair and sank into it, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. The sterile smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint scent of Joan's perfume, a reminder of the mother she had only known through fragmented pieces of her own history. Flashbacks played in Emily's mind like a relentless reel. She saw herself as a child, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, the sound of her mother's footsteps echoing as they grew fainter and eventually disappeared. The memory of unanswered phone calls, the empty seat at family gatherings, and the silence that followed were like sharp pangs in her heart. Emily's reflection was interrupted by the soft creak of the door. Dr. Harris entered, his presence a brief respite from Emily's relentless internal struggle. He carried a clipboard, his professional demeanor masking the concern in his eyes. "How's she doing?" Dr. Harris asked, his voice gentle yet probing. Emily forced a tight smile, trying to mask the storm of emotions churning inside her. "She's holding steady. We're keeping a close watch. The next few hours are critical." Dr. Harris nodded, his gaze lingering on Emily. "You're doing well, Emily. If you need anything, just let me know." As he left, Emily was once again alone with Joan. The brief interaction with Dr. Harris had done little to ease her internal conflict. She found herself grappling with an overwhelming sense of betrayal and confusion. How could she reconcile the professional role she played with the deeply personal revelation she had just faced? The weight of unanswered questions pressed heavily on her chest. Emily's hands shook as she picked up the chart at the foot of Joan's bed. She needed answers about her mother's past, about why Joan had left, and about what this revelation meant for her own sense of identity. The chart was filled with medical jargon and clinical observations, but Emily's eyes struggled to focus on the words. Her mind was miles away, tangled in a web of past grievances and present responsibilities. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. Emily knew she had to stay focused, to perform her duties with the same precision she always had. But every beep of the monitor, every rustle of the bedclothes, seemed to amplify the inner discord she was feeling. The sterile environment of the hospital room, with its buzzing lights and constant hum of medical equipment, felt like a world apart from the warmth and chaos of her childhood home. The contrast was stark and painful. Emily found herself longing for answers that seemed just out of reach, like trying to grasp the fleeting shadows cast by the morning light. She reached for her phone, needing a distraction from the whirlpool of emotions threatening to consume her. Messages from colleagues and friends, well-meaning but detached from her current reality, flickered on the screen. Emily swiped them away, unable to find solace in their routine updates. As the morning light grew stronger, Emily knew she couldn't afford to let her personal turmoil interfere with her responsibilities. She had to keep her focus sharp, to make decisions based on medical facts rather than emotional impulses. Yet, as she looked at Joan's pale, still face, the emotional chasm between them seemed wider than ever. The battle within Emily was far from over. Each passing minute in the hospital room was a reminder of the complex relationship she had with the woman who had given her life but left it in disarray. The morning was just beginning, but for Emily, the day ahead was filled with the daunting task of reconciling her past with her present, while striving to give Joan the care she needed. The hospital was slowly waking up to the new day. The soft, pale light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows that danced across the sterile white walls. Emily Parker stood at the nursing station, her gaze distant as she reviewed Joan Parker's medical charts for what felt like the 100th time. The gravity of the situation was heavy on her shoulders, and every glance at the charts felt like a reminder of the difficult choices that lay ahead. Emily's colleagues bustled around her, engaged in their routines with a professional detachment that Emily envied. The hum of conversations, the clatter of medical equipment, and the distant beep of monitors created a rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts. Yet, despite the organized chaos around her, Emily felt isolated, her mind consumed by the weight of her own dilemmas. Dr. Harris approached the station, his expression thoughtful. "Emily, we need to discuss Joan Parker's treatment plan. Her condition is more critical than we initially thought. There are a few decisions we need to make about her care." Emily nodded, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the desk. "Yes, of course. What are the options? Dr. Harris pulled up a stool and took a seat next to her, the seriousness of his demeanor underscoring the gravity of the situation. Joan's vitals are unstable. We have a few treatment options, but each comes with its own risks. We could initiate an aggressive intervention, which might stabilize her but could also lead to further complications. Alternatively, we could opt for a more conservative approach, focusing on palliative care to make her comfortable. Emily's heart raced at the thought of the decision. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, professional duty clashing with personal connection. Each choice seemed to carry its own weight, and the thought of making the wrong decision was paralyzing. "Can we afford to wait?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens if we don't act now?" Dr. Harris's gaze was steady, but his words were weighted with concern. Waiting could lead to further deterioration. If we don't intervene aggressively, we risk losing her. However, the aggressive treatment could also mean extended suffering or potential complications. It's a tough call. Emily's eyes wandered back to Joan's room, the door slightly ajar. She could see Joan lying there, so vulnerable and fragile, and her heart ached at the thought of making a choice that could end her mother's life. The personal connection made the decision infinitely more complex. She was not just a nurse in this situation. She was a daughter torn between professional judgment and emotional turmoil. Taking a deep breath, Emily forced herself to think clearly. She knew that whatever decision she made, it would not only impact Joan's health but also be a defining moment in her own life. She was faced with a profound choice, one that would shape her future and her understanding of her own role in her mother's life. "Dr. Harris, I need some time to think about this," Emily said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty she felt inside. "Can we discuss this again in an hour?" Dr. Harris nodded, understanding the weight of her request. "Of course, Emily. Take all the time you need. We're here to support you." As he walked away, Emily turned her focus inward. The hospital corridors felt both vast and confining, a maze that mirrored her internal struggle. She wandered aimlessly, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and determination. The weight of the decision bore down on her, each step feeling heavier than the last. Emily finally found herself in a quiet break room, away from the constant flow of patients and staff. She sat at a small table, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to hold onto her composure. The room was dimly lit, the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant echoes of hospital activity providing a background murmur. The solitude of the break room offered a brief respite from the frenetic energy of the emergency room. Emily closed her eyes, letting the quiet envelop her. She thought of the family she had lost, the memories of her childhood, and the void left by Joan's absence. The weight of the decision was not just a matter of medical judgment. It was intertwined with years of unresolved feelings and unanswered questions. Emily reached for her phone, scrolling through old photos and messages. She saw images of herself as a child, surrounded by friends and family, and realized how much she had missed. The decision she faced was not just about Joan's treatment. It was about confronting her past and reconciling with the mother she barely knew. With a deep breath, Emily stood up, determination replacing her earlier indecision. She knew that whatever choice she made, it had to be guided by both professional expertise and the complex web of her emotions. She returned to Joan's room, ready to make the difficult decision, prepared to face whatever consequences lay ahead. The moment of truth was approaching, and Emily felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She knew that this decision would define not only Joan's future but also her own, marking a pivotal point in both their lives. The soft rustling of papers filled the small office as Emily Parker sifted through a stack of medical records. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden hue through the narrow window blinds, creating a stark contrast to the emotional chill that enveloped her. Emily's fingers moved methodically over the documents, each page revealing fragments of her mother's life that she had never known. The office was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden chair beneath Emily. She had requested access to Joan Parker's medical history, hoping to find clarity about her mother's condition and, perhaps, some insight into the woman she had never truly known. As the minutes ticked by, Emily's sense of anticipation grew, mingling with a pang of apprehension. The records were filled with medical jargon and clinical terms, but amidst the sterile descriptions, there were hints of Joan's personal life, details about her struggles, her past, and her family. Emily's eyes lingered on a particular note, written in a hurried scrawl by a previous doctor. The note mentioned a series of social and economic hardships that had impacted Joan's life significantly. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read about Joan's turbulent past. Marital problems, financial instability, and a series of misfortunes that had driven her to the edge. The notes painted a picture of a woman who had fought battles far beyond the confines of her hospital room. It was a revelation that shattered the idealized image Emily had held of her mother. A soft knock on the door interrupted Emily's thoughts. She looked up to see Dr. Harris standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Emily, do you have a moment to talk?" Emily nodded, her gaze shifting back to the papers scattered across the desk. "Sure, Dr. Harris. Just give me a second." Dr. Harris entered the room and took a seat across from her. The office, with its worn furniture and piles of paperwork, felt suddenly intimate. Emily's hands fidgeted with the edges of the medical records, her mind racing with the newfound information. "Everything okay?" Dr. Harris asked, his tone gentle yet probing. Emily took a deep breath, her mind grappling with the weight of the documents before her. "I've been going through Joan's records. I had no idea about the extent of her struggles." Dr. Harris's expression softened with empathy. "Sometimes the personal histories we uncover can be surprising. It's a lot to take in, especially when it's someone so close to you." Emily nodded, her gaze distant. "I never knew this side of her. All these years, I had this image of a mother who simply walked away. I didn't understand the full picture, how difficult her life had been." Dr. Harris leaned forward, his eyes compassionate. "Understanding her past might help you make sense of the present. It doesn't erase the pain, but it can offer perspective." Emily's thoughts wandered back to her childhood, the unanswered questions and the silence that had always surrounded her mother's absence. The revelation from the records was like a key unlocking a door to the past, a past she had never fully understood. She felt a mixture of sadness and relief, as if she was finally piecing together a puzzle that had long been incomplete. As Emily processed the information, her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. She glanced at the screen. Messages from friends and family, all filled with concern and encouragement. She silenced the phone, feeling the weight of her responsibilities and the personal stakes of the situation. Dr. Harris's voice brought Emily back to the present. "Is there anything else you need, Emily? We're here to support you through this." Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. "I think I need to talk to Joan. I need to understand her, why she made the choices she did, and how that fits into everything now." Dr. Harris nodded. "I'll give you some time. Just remember, it's important to balance your personal emotions with your professional duties." As Dr. Harris left, Emily gathered the medical records and made her way back to Joan's room. The hospital corridor felt colder now, the reality of the situation pressing down on her with each step. The past she had just uncovered seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders, a burden she was not sure how to carry. Entering Joan's room, Emily's gaze fell on her mother, still lying unconscious. The sight of Joan, vulnerable and frail, was a stark reminder of the personal stakes involved. Emily knew she had to confront the truth, to seek answers and find a way to reconcile the mother she had lost with the woman who lay before her. Emily took a deep breath and pulled up a chair beside Joan's bed. The soft beeping of the monitor and the rhythmic rise and fall of Joan's chest were a reminder of the fragility of life. Emily's mind raced as she prepared for the difficult conversations that lay ahead, both with Joan and within herself. The past had been revealed, and with it came the challenge of facing and understanding it in the present moment. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows in the hospital corridors, its fading light mixing with the sterile fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. Emily Parker paced nervously outside Joan's room, her footsteps echoing off the polished tiles. The day had seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment dragging as she waited for any sign of improvement or decline. A sudden commotion from the direction of the ER caught her attention. The rush of medical personnel, the urgent beeping of equipment, and the hurried footsteps were an unwelcome reminder of the unpredictable nature of the day. Emily's heart raced with a sense of foreboding. She knew that in the realm of emergency medicine, things could change in an instant. As she approached Joan's room, she noticed Dr. Harris and a team of nurses working frantically. Her pulse quickened. The sight of their focused expressions and swift movements sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She caught Dr. Harris's eye, and the concerned look on his face did nothing to alleviate her fears. "Dr. Harris, what's happening?" Emily asked, her voice betraying the unease she felt. Dr. Harris glanced up, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with a sudden and severe decline in Joan's condition. Her vitals are dropping and we're trying to stabilize her. It's critical right now." Emily's breath hitched as she pushed past the nurses and entered the room. Joan's once steady rhythm on the monitor had become erratic, the beeping increasing in frequency and urgency. The sight of Joan, her face pale and her breathing labored, was a painful reminder of the fragility of life. The team worked with intense focus, their movements a blur of practiced efficiency. Emily stood to the side, her mind racing as she tried to process the gravity of the situation. She felt helpless, her role as a daughter clashing with her professional instincts as a nurse. A nurse handed Dr. Harris a syringe, and he administered medication with a steady hand. "We're administering epinephrine to stabilize her heart rate," Dr. Harris explained briefly. "If we don't see improvement soon, we may need to consider other interventions." Emily's hands gripped the edge of a nearby counter, her knuckles white from the strain. She watched as the team continued their efforts, each second stretching into an eternity. The room was filled with the sounds of medical equipment, a cacophony of alarms and beeps that only heightened her anxiety. Dr. Harris's voice cut through the din, calm but firm. "Emily, I need you to step out for a moment. We need to focus on this without any distractions." Reluctantly, Emily stepped back into the corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The intensity of the situation left her feeling disoriented, as if she were caught in a storm with no way to navigate its chaos. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. In the quiet of the hallway, Emily's mind raced through a torrent of emotions: fear, frustration, and a deep-seated sense of inadequacy. She had faced crises before, but this was different. This was her mother, and the stakes felt impossibly high. Minutes felt like hours as Emily waited, her eyes fixed on the door to Joan's room. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and she turned to see Dr. Harris approaching. His expression was somber, and Emily's heart sank at the sight of him. "How is she?" Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Dr. Harris took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers with a mix of compassion and exhaustion. "We managed to stabilize her for now, but her condition is still very critical. We need to monitor her closely and be prepared for any sudden changes." Emily nodded, trying to absorb the news. Her emotions were a tangled mess of relief and dread. She knew that the crisis had been averted for the moment, but the uncertainty of Joan's future weighed heavily on her. Dr. Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emily, I know this is incredibly difficult, but we're doing everything we can. It's important to stay focused and be prepared for the next steps." As Dr. Harris returned to Joan's room, Emily took a moment to compose herself. The corridor, once a place of routine and order, now felt like an emotional battlefield. She had to find a way to balance her personal feelings with her professional responsibilities, to navigate the storm of her mother's health crisis with both compassion and clarity. Emily's thoughts drifted to the medical records she had studied earlier, the revelations about Joan's past and the struggles she had faced. The sudden health crisis had brought everything into sharp focus, highlighting the fragile nature of life and the relentless march of time. With a deep breath, Emily steeled herself for what lay ahead. The crisis had been a harsh reminder of the unpredictability of medicine, and she knew that the coming hours would be crucial. As she prepared to re-enter Joan's room, she resolved to face the challenges with strength and resolve, determined to support her mother through whatever came next. The hospital room was eerily quiet after the recent flurry of activity. Joan's breathing had steadied, but the gravity of her condition left an unspoken tension in the air. Emily Parker sat by her mother's bedside, the soft hum of the ventilator the only sound breaking the silence. The day's events had been a whirlwind of emotion and stress, and now, as the adrenaline ebbed, Emily faced a moment of introspection. The gentle hum of the machines was oddly comforting, providing a rhythm to the otherwise stillness of the room. Emily's gaze was fixed on Joan's face, the pallor of her skin a stark contrast to the vibrant woman she had imagined in her memories. The contrast between the vibrant woman she had known and the frail figure before her was a painful reminder of the distance that had grown between them. Emily reached out and took her mother's hand, the gesture both tentative and desperate. The warmth of Joan's hand felt strangely familiar, a flicker of connection amid the uncertainty. She couldn't ignore the years of absence and the pain that had accumulated between them. The room, bathed in the soft light of a late afternoon, felt like a stage set for a confrontation that had long been overdue. As Emily sat there, her thoughts swirled with unresolved questions and painful memories. The revelations from Joan's medical records had shed light on the struggles her mother had faced, but they hadn't answered the questions that gnawed at Emily's heart. Why had Joan left? What had driven her to make the choices that had so drastically altered their lives? The door to the room creaked open, and Dr. Harris entered, carrying a clipboard and a look of determined resolve. He approached Emily with a sympathetic nod. "How's she doing?" Emily looked up, her eyes tired but resolute. "Stable for now, but I need to understand her, Dr. Harris. I need to make sense of all this." Dr. Harris nodded understandingly. "I know this is difficult, but sometimes the answers we seek come from within ourselves. Confronting your own emotions and experiences might be just as important as understanding her medical history." Emily nodded, taking in Dr. Harris's words. The confrontation she needed wasn't just with her mother, but with her own feelings and the painful history they shared. She had to come to terms with the past before she could truly face Joan. After Dr. Harris left, Emily remained seated, lost in thought. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her as she wrestled with the memories of her childhood, the feelings of abandonment, and the longing for answers that had haunted her for years. The sound of Joan's labored breathing filled the silence, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the time that had been lost. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. She had to confront the pain she felt, the anger and the sorrow, if she was to find any semblance of closure. With a resolute sigh, Emily leaned forward, speaking softly to her unconscious mother. "I need you to hear me, Mom. I need you to know how much you've missed, and how much I've missed having you in my life. I don't know why things happened the way they did, but I need to understand. I need to find some kind of resolution." The room remained silent, Joan's steady breathing the only response. Emily's voice trembled as she continued. "I've spent so many years building a life without you, trying to understand why you left. I fought to forgive you, but it's hard when I don't have the answers. I hope that one day, I can find it in my heart to truly forgive and move forward. But right now, I'm struggling." As Emily spoke, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The act of voicing her feelings, of confronting the emotional turmoil that had been bottled up for years, was both cathartic and painful. The weight of the past was heavy, but she felt a glimmer of hope that facing these emotions might bring some semblance of peace. The door opened again, this time revealing a nurse with a tray of medications. Emily watched as the nurse administered the medications, her mind still wrestling with the thoughts and emotions stirred up by the day's events. As the nurse finished her task and left the room, Emily was left alone once more with her mother. The quiet of the room was now filled with a tentative sense of resolution. Emily knew that confronting her own feelings was just the beginning of a long journey. She had to continue exploring the past, understanding the complexities of her mother's life, and finding a way to heal the wounds that had long shaped her own life. With a deep breath, Emily rose from her seat, her resolve firming. She knew that the path to understanding and forgiveness would be challenging, but she was prepared to face it head-on. As she looked at Joan, A flicker of determination crossed her face. She was ready to confront the past and seek the answers that would allow her to finally find peace. The hospital room felt colder than usual, the sterile scent of antiseptic hanging heavy in the air. Emily Parker sat in the dim light of the early morning, the exhaustion etched deep into her features. Her eyes, red and hollow, traced the slow rise and fall of her mother's chest, each breath a reminder of the fragility of life. The days had blurred into a ceaseless cycle of worry and despair. Joan's condition had remained precarious, her moments of stability quickly overshadowed by new complications. Each time Emily thought there might be a glimmer of hope, it was swiftly extinguished by a new wave of uncertainty. Dr. Harris had just left after another round of updates, his news no less grim than before. The medications were no longer having the desired effect, and Joan's body seemed to be giving in to the relentless assault of illness. The weight of each word from Dr. Harris pressed heavily on Emily's chest, leaving her feeling trapped in a relentless storm with no end in sight. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds with a metronomic indifference, each sound amplifying Emily's sense of isolation. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was now a source of agonizing tension, each beep a sharp reminder of the uncertain future. Emily looked around the room, the sterile environment and the beeping machines a stark contrast to the warmth of the memories she had been trying to piece together. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls bearing witness to the despair that had become her constant companion. She stood up, her legs feeling heavy and unsteady. As she walked to the window, she pulled aside the curtain and stared out at the bleak, gray dawn. The world outside seemed as cold and unwelcoming as the hospital room, the sky a wash of dreary hues that matched her mood. Her thoughts swirled in a vortex of frustration and sorrow. She had hoped that confronting her emotions would bring clarity, but instead, she found herself sinking deeper into a quagmire of doubt and helplessness. The more she tried to make sense of her mother's condition and the fractured relationship between them, the more overwhelmed she felt. Emily's reflection in the window seemed a ghostly echo of herself, her face pale and lined with the weight of sleepless nights and unrelenting anxiety. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the oppressive sense of hopelessness that had settled over her like a shroud. The door to the room creaked open, and a nurse entered with a tray of medications. Emily turned, her gaze vacant as she watched the nurse go through the routine of checking Joan's vitals and administering medication. The nurse's presence, though professional and composed, did little to lift the heavy atmosphere that enveloped the room. As the nurse left, Emily sank back into the chair by Joan's bedside, her hands trembling. The reality of Joan's condition seemed insurmountable, and the sense of helplessness gnawed at her. Every attempt to find solace or hope seemed to unravel in the face of mounting despair. In that moment, the weight of the situation pressed down on her, and Emily allowed herself to break. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with the intensity of her sobs. The tears flowed uncontrollably, each one a release of the pent-up anguish and frustration she had been holding inside. The room, once filled with the clinical sounds of medical equipment, now felt like a sanctuary for Emily's raw, unfiltered emotions. The sobs were a testament to the depths of her struggle, a cathartic release that she had been suppressing in her efforts to remain strong. As the tears eventually subsided, Emily sat in the quiet aftermath, the room now echoing with the remnants of her emotional outpouring. The silence felt heavy, yet strangely comforting, as if it allowed her to confront the depth of her pain and helplessness. Emily took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with a newfound sense of exhaustion. The room seemed to shift, the oppressive weight of her despair slowly giving way to a glimmer of resolve. Despite the crushing sense of defeat, she knew she had to find a way to keep moving forward, to confront the challenges that lay ahead. With a determined exhale, Emily wiped her tears and looked at Joan, her face set with a mixture of resolve and sadness. The journey was far from over, and the path was fraught with uncertainty. But in that quiet moment, Emily made a silent vow to herself and to her mother. She would find a way to face the darkness, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. As the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Emily felt a flicker of hope amidst the bleakness. The path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. The sun had finally risen, casting a pale light into the hospital room that seemed to pierce through the gloom that had settled over Emily Parker. The once oppressive weight of despair had begun to lift, replaced by a hesitant sense of determination. The room felt different now, as though the first rays of daylight had infused it with a new kind of hope. Emily had barely slept, her mind racing with the decisions she needed to make. The previous night's emotional breakdown had left her raw and vulnerable, but it also gave her the clarity she needed. She knew that she couldn't continue in this state of limbo. She had to confront her mother, and more importantly, she had to make decisions that would shape their future. She glanced at Joan, who lay quietly in the bed, her breathing steady but shallow. The beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of the precariousness of her condition. The sight of her mother's frail form brought a renewed wave of determination. Emily was no longer content to let the situation control her. She needed to take charge, to find a way to bridge the gap that had grown between them. With a deep breath, Emily stood up and walked to the window. The outside world seemed vibrant and full of possibilities, a stark contrast to the confinement of the hospital room. She could see people going about their lives, oblivious to the personal storm raging inside her. It was a reminder of the world that existed beyond these walls, a world she needed to re-engage with. Dr. Harris entered the room, his expression serious but hopeful. "Morning, Emily. I wanted to discuss Joan's condition and our next steps." Emily turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. "I'm ready to talk. I need to understand what's next and what my role is in all of this." Dr. Harris nodded, taking a seat by the bed. "We've been monitoring Joan closely. Her condition remains stable, but she's still at risk. We need to discuss her treatment options and what you want to do moving forward." Emily's heart raced at the thought of making decisions that would impact her mother's life. The weight of responsibility felt immense, but she knew she had to face it. She took a seat across from Dr. Harris, her mind focused on the immediate concerns. "I've been thinking a lot," Emily began, her voice steady. "I want to make sure that whatever decisions we make are in Joan's best interest, but I also need to consider what's best for me. I can't ignore the past, and I can't pretend that everything is okay just because she's sick." Dr. Harris listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. "That's a very mature approach, Emily. It's important to balance her needs with your own well-being. If you need time to process and decide, we can give you that. But we also need to act swiftly to address her medical needs." Emily took a deep breath, the enormity of the situation settling over her. "I need to know more about her condition, the prognosis, and the treatment options. I also need to think about what kind of relationship I want to have with her moving forward. This is all overwhelming, and I don't want to make any hasty decisions." Dr. Harris's eyes softened with understanding. "I'll provide you with all the information you need, and we can discuss the options in detail. It's clear you're committed to making informed choices, and that's important." As Dr. Harris outlined the treatment options and potential outcomes, Emily listened intently, her mind grappling with the complexities of the situation. Each option carried its own set of risks and benefits, and she knew she had to weigh them carefully. The decisions she made now would have a profound impact on her mother's future and her own. After Dr. Harris left, Emily sat in the quiet room, her thoughts swirling. The enormity of the choices she faced felt both daunting and liberating. She had the power to shape the future, but she also carried the weight of her past. The journey to reconciliation was not just about healing her relationship with Joan, but also about coming to terms with her own feelings and choices. She reached for her mother's hand, the warmth of it grounding her amidst the whirlwind of emotions. The connection she felt was a reminder of the bond that still existed despite the years of separation and pain. With renewed determination, Emily stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. She took out a notebook and began jotting down her thoughts and decisions. It was time to take action, to confront the past, and to make choices that would lead to healing and reconciliation. The day was just beginning, and with it came the promise of new opportunities. Emily knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to face it with courage and resolve. She had taken the first step toward reconciliation, and now she needed to continue moving forward one decision at a time. The early morning light filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting a gentle glow over the sterile surroundings. Emily Parker sat in the quiet space beside her mother's bed, her gaze fixed on Joan, who now looked more peaceful than she had in days. The shadows of past conflicts and pain seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a newfound sense of calm and resolution. Emily's heart was lighter than it had been in weeks. The difficult decisions had been made, and a plan was set in motion for Joan's care and their future. There was still a long road ahead, but Emily felt a sense of closure beginning to settle over her, like a veil slowly being lifted. Joan's breathing was steady, a comforting rhythm that Emily found soothing. She reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Joan's face, her touch tender and affectionate. The act was more than a gesture of care. It was a symbol of her commitment to repairing their fractured relationship. A knock at the door broke the quiet, and Dr. Harris entered, his expression hopeful and reassuring. "Good morning, Emily. I wanted to update you on Joan's progress and discuss the next steps." Emily looked up, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and optimism. "Good morning, Dr. Harris. I'm ready to hear what's next." Dr. Harris took a seat, his demeanor professional yet warm. "Joan's condition has stabilized, and the treatment plan we discussed is underway. It's going to be a long road, but we're optimistic. I also wanted to talk about support systems and resources for you. It's important to take care of yourself during this time." Emily nodded, absorbing the information. The weight of the past weeks felt less burdensome now, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. "Thank you, Dr. Harris. I appreciate all the support. I'm ready to focus on moving forward and finding a way to heal, both for Joan and for myself." Dr. Harris offered a reassuring smile. "You're doing great, Emily. Remember, healing is a process, and it's okay to take it one step at a time." As Dr. Harris left the room, Emily felt a surge of gratitude. She turned back to Joan, who seemed to be resting more comfortably. The decisions had been challenging, but they had led to this moment of fragile hope and potential renewal. Emily took out her notebook, the one she had used to jot down her thoughts and plans. She began to write, not just about the medical aspects of their situation, but about the emotional journey they had endured. Each word was a step toward understanding, forgiveness, and the possibility of a fresh start. The door opened once more, this time admitting a familiar figure. Lily, Emily's young daughter, entered with a small bouquet of daisies. Her face lit up with a bright smile. "Mommy, I brought flowers for Grandma." Emily's heart swelled with emotion at the sight of her daughter's innocent gesture. She took Lily's hand and guided her gently to the bedside. Lily carefully placed the flowers in a vase on the small table beside Joan, her actions full of earnest love. Joan's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at Lily with a weak but genuine smile. It was a small but significant moment, a connection that bridged the past and the present. Emily watched, feeling a mix of hope and relief as she saw the beginnings of a new chapter unfold. Lily turned to Emily, her curiosity evident. "Mommy, is Grandma going to be okay?" Emily knelt beside her daughter, her voice soft and reassuring. "Yes, sweetheart. Grandma is getting better, and we're all here to help her." Lily nodded, her innocent belief in the healing power of family adding to the warmth of the room. Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose, a clear reminder of what truly mattered. The path ahead was still uncertain, but with her family by her side and a new resolve to build bridges and create a fresh start, Emily felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the morning sun bathed the room in a gentle light, Emily took Lily's hand and walked with her to the window. They looked out at the world beyond, where the promise of a new beginning seemed to stretch out before them. The hospital room, once a place of intense struggle, now felt like a sanctuary of hope and renewal. Emily knew that the road to healing would be long and filled with obstacles, but she was determined to walk it with strength and love. With a final glance at Joan, Emily whispered softly, "We're starting a new chapter, Mom, one step at a time." The sunlight continued to pour into the room, illuminating the path ahead. Emily, Lily and Joan were poised on the brink of a new beginning, their hearts and minds ready to embrace the future with hope and resilience. Click on the video being recommended to you now